Hello, guys and gals, me Mudahar, and there's actually been a pretty big update on David. 5 days worth of updates on one of the most insane stories that I think I've covered on my channel. So for anybody that doesn't understand full context, a while back we looked at a story of a Tesla with a body inside it at a Hollywood tow yard in in Southern California. So, people found this body, right, inside a Tesla that belonged to a former music star known as David. Now, for a while, this guy was touring and everything and yada, 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 until eventually everything just sort of stopped. Now, a few months ago, back in April, when we looked at David, this sort of thing started heating up again, right? His case was brought for, and he was actually, charged and whatnot. In the last 5 days, there have been so much stuff coming out, there have been so much things releasing about David, that at this point, honestly, I think it's so heinous. I think this guy should get the actual death penalty based on the kind of shit that we're reading, okay? What we're about to discuss today is some of the most, harrowing shit you'll ever see. Some of the most, gut-wrenching stuff you'll see. And honestly, at the same time, it should be angering because it almost feels like this could have been something that would have been avoided had, I would say, anybody given the slightest amount of care towards the actual girl, Celeste Rivas, any form of care. Anyways, let's get started with what's been going on, okay? So, again, to give you the full timeline over here, back in 20th of April, 2026, this year, David was charged with murder, continuous abuse of a child under the age of 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. And then there were also special circumstance allegations, murdering a witness, murdering for financial gain, and then lying in wait. So to understand all of the stuff that's been going on, there have been multiple circumstances. There have been, people mentioning that there was 40 terabytes of seized evidence that the prosecution had, multiple felony counts. And ultimately, at the end, the discussion that has sort of been happening the last 5 days is whether this is going to go to trial. So to give you an idea, this is actually going to go to trial. There was so much disgusting stuff that came out that it actually basically had to be going over there, right? The people have met their burdens on every count. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to go on board. It's going to go there, bail is denied, and the defense basically has to really find a way to protect this scumbag piece of crap. So to kind of understand this sort of story, you have to go all the way back to January of 2022, where was the first contact of David Burke, also known as David, and Celeste Rivas. Now, inside this case, a lot of information had come out and a better timeline was sort of established. One of the detectives involved over here, Detective Farrell, actually brought up a message all the way back from 8th of August 2022. This was at a point when David Burke met a girl called Celeste, who at the time was actually 11 years old, okay? So this is how young this girl is. To give you an idea, right, this is an 11-year-old person, right? This is not somebody that was 15 or 16 at the time. This is literally an 11-year-old little girl that this person had ended up meeting, coming across, and ultimately, allegedly, of course, murdering. So again, to move on forward, when Burke was 18 and Celeste was 13, there was a alleged relationship that began. There was actually text messages that the prosecution brought up that had to deal with pregnancies and abortions and contraceptions and all the things you shouldn't be talking about with a goddamn 13-year-old, okay? Again, disgusting stuff. So January 2024 comes by and Detective Farrell actually comes out and tells the investigators that they confirmed that this girl at the age of 13 had one abortion already, okay? So we're actually looking at 2 abortions, right? This is number 1. Again, the information that comes out, as I was telling you, is incredibly harrowing with this story. So on 17th February of 2024, a welfare check actually happens, where a LASD Deputy Juan Gonzalez ends up going to Burke's home on Dewey Drive in West Hollywood. And again, over here at the Riverside County's request, because Celeste was reported missing at the time, they played body cam footage in the courtrooms where Burke had said that he had actually met this girl through Discord, believed she was 18. So April 2024 comes by, and the first week, Celeste is reported missing at Lake Elsinore. She's basically reported 3 times missing in the last year of her actual life. So again, 2024 rolls out, and then they travel together, right? They go to Las Vegas, where again the prosecution showed a booking at Trump Hotel. They went to London, they went to Texas to meet his family, And the prosecutors actually even alleged that Burke was paying a classmate like $1,000 to buy Celeste a replacement phone after at one point her parents actually confiscated her old phone. So then April 23rd, 2025 comes by where it gets incredibly disgusting, right? April 22nd, an argument occurs between Celeste. So they have this long, lengthy text exchange where Celeste, she's like jealous of all the other girls, and she's actually threatened to expose this underage relationship to the public. And remember, this guy has a pretty bumping career at the time, right? He's like one of the big, played artists on Spotify. I didn't really know how big David was until I was researching this. This guy was in like Fortnite concerts. There are millions of plays that this guy, his guy actually had a very serious career. Even monetarily, which we'll look at, is pretty impressive. So ultimately, she threatens to expose the relationship, and about a day later, the homicide is actually alleged to have happened. An Uber brings Celeste from Lake Elsinore to the Hollywood Hills home. So the prosecutors actually say here that Burke was allegedly stabbing her repeatedly at arrival, and basically stood by as she actually bled out. And again, then sent messages asking where she was as part of an actual cover-up that was beginning here. So Detective Farrell comes in and says that the last recovered conversation between them is actually dated to this day. So then April 23rd, 2025 rolls, again, same day, the first Santa Barbara run actually happens. So you remember when we talked about that Tesla and I was basically going over every single time that I talked about David, what happens when they pull the Tesla information out? Teslas are constantly connected to the internet, so I was always wondering, man, could they not just pull the information out of the car? Maybe, just maybe, they could be able to pull something out of the vehicle's cameras. Maybe the car picked up something on Sentry mode. Maybe allegedly if somebody was stuffing a body into it, maybe any of the cameras could have caught that. But thankfully in this case, it actually seems that the Tesla telemetry analysis showed that the phone and the vehicle were traveling together at the State Route 154 at around 11:31 p.m. So on the 24th of April, an outgoing call from his cell phone to Celeste goes to voicemail while the vehicle was actually headed northbound, returning to the residence at around 7 a.m. So of course, on April 24th to May 5th, 2025, the prosecutors actually alleged that a shovel, 2 chainsaws, a body bag, heavy-duty laundry bags, and a blue inflatable kiddie pool and a burn cage were ordered under a false name and then delivered to his address. So interestingly, the burn cage was actually reported all the way back, if we talked about this back in December, by the private investigator that was retained by the owner of the actual property, right? David's landlord. So ultimately, the actual Amazon account was using the name Travion Davis. Now again, it kind of shows you, a little bit of how stupid this guy is, right? Like purchasing these items, like literally a corpse disposal kit to his home. But again, remember how decomposed like Celeste was. What's scary is in some capacity, if he was even a little bit, if he was slightly smarter, he might have actually found a way to have gotten away with this if he was able to properly remove a body from the equation. People would ask questions, but I think when it comes to murder cases, like having the body is incredibly important. And ultimately, that was the one thing where he really fucked up on. So again, down the road, May 4th, 2025 comes by, a 10-inch Makita chainsaw is purchased from Home Depot and delivered via Postmates. And this was never recovered, right? So then there were 2 further trips by a phone and a Tesla, which again, they were traveling together, to the same remote Santa Barbara County area. A charging session in Santa Ynez matched the vehicle's infotainment records. Again, Teslas pretty much keep all this information for, again, law enforcement, to grab all this metadata, right? So July 29, 2025 rolls, and the final drive happens, right? The data shows that his phone is disconnecting from the vehicle's onboard, infotainment system. A neighbor's camera record shows him walking back towards the house, and an automated license plate reader, again, we talk a lot about how evil, those flock cameras can be, but ultimately, at the end of the day, thankfully, in one case here, a camera near Bluebird Avenue was actually able to spot the vehicle, right? Which is where he was departing for his tour for the album Withered. So September 3rd to 5th, 2025 comes, the vehicle is cited for a 72-hour parking ordinance, and then it's towed to the Hollywood impound yard. which at this point, September 8th comes where people actually discover the body in the vehicle because of that strong odor. And this is where, again, it's a black body bag containing the head, the torso, and then beneath it, a garbage bag containing severed arms and legs, right? And honestly, a day after that would have probably been the 15th birthday for this little actual baby. Again, it's a little girl. It's a baby at the end of the day. So there were actually more tattoos that were brought in by the prosecution, right? For instance, remember when we were looking at the actual internet, like researchers looking into this, they found that, David and Celeste were having like matching tattoos on their fingers. Well, the prosecution actually alleged that the reason her left ring and pinky fingers were amputated is that the ring finger carried a tattoo of his name, and on the fourth day of this actual preliminary stuff with the court, they were shown a photograph of a female hand with red cursive David tattoos. And those fingers, those two, were not actually in the Tesla at the time. One of the bridges they found in this was an email address, right? Basically, the same account was used to purchase airline tickets for David and Celeste, and was actually linked to the Amazon account that ordered those two electric chainsaws under that name, Travion Davis, that we saw earlier, right? The shovel third saw via the Uber Postmates. So again, where one of the stupidest things that, again, David did, and thankfully was stupid enough, is that he had kind of connected all of this evidence together under the email address, under the Tesla metadata, right? This guy thought he was smart. He thought he was good at trying to hide a body, but thankfully it was the metadata, and it was a lot of the digital evidence that kind of linked it all together, right? It basically caught him red-handed. So on day 2 of the entire course, right, there were 2 financial witnesses that were brought in because they wanted to talk about these special circumstances regarding David's financial gain theory. And this is where, again, a bunch of figures had come out where it showed how much money that David would actually be earning, right? So because he was partnered up with some of these big record agencies, he would be paid out, about $19 million in the full potential value if he actually had, given all of his albums, which obviously David will not be doing. Now, again, obviously you can imagine, right? Like, man, what stands between me and $19 million is this 13-year-old girl that absolutely could ruin my career. And again, I guess David thought that allegedly the best course of action would to actually be snuffing her out, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, he had this huge career, and she had the potentiality to completely destroy it. Now, when the Tesla was actually found, they found at least 11 air fresheners in the vehicle. I guess they thought that this was going to somehow, sort of counteract the smell of a dead body, which again shows you how stupid these fucking people are. And thankfully, it was their stupidity that probably will land them with the possible death penalty. And if not, life in prison, as this scumbag deserves for what he allegedly might have done to a little girl. So when they checked the Hollywood Hills garage, they found, again, a couple of extra things that actually made the entire courtroom sort of gasp a little bit too, right? They found a rowing machine and a charging plug for a Tesla carrying bloodstains, right? There were trash bags testing positive inside and out. And of course, they were running the luminol, they were running the actual, trace fluids to check for, again, blood. And they'd even found this blue inflatable pool crumpled into a ball, which again, they tested it. It had no visible stain, but it did react to Blue Star. It smelled like fresh laundry. And again, there were 2 chainsaws in the garage, but those actually did test negative for blood. So there were 2 findings on the 3rd day, which were cutting in opposite directions over here. First was that Burke was included as this possible contributor in a 4-person DNA mixture swabbed from the outside of this garage trash bag. Second of all, the same bag contained wipes with brown staining that returned a profile roughly 3 trillion more times likely to be Celeste's rather than a stranger, and Burke's DNA was not detected on the wipe. On the cross-examination, they conceded that the DNA transfers without direct contact and that the software calculated only inclusion, not identity. So she maintained her professional opinion that his DNA was on the bag. That is very important to understand here. So then the cell site and Tesla telemetry also got brought in and questioned as well too. So again, according to this, the 2 identifiers, which were the IMSI of his handset, his cellular device, and the Tesla's onboard modem, right? So basically, it showed that when these devices were connected together, it showed that they were traveling in unison, effectively meaning that it would have been him in his own car, right? That's how the metadata kind of captures you. Now, when it came time for her autopsy, this is again where things get even more harrowing. At the time, at her examination, she was like 71 pounds, okay? A mass amount of her organs, like we're talking decompositional organ loss, like that was the words that you were kind of reading in this entire courtroom, right? And again, portions of her face, partially skeletonized, left eye was completely absent, tissue, soft tissue specifically, liquefied, okay? And there was, again, insect activity because the body was decomposing for so long. Again, you can imagine what happens to a human body when it's left out in the California sun for, again, God knows how long, right? So then day 4 of the court case comes by and they were talking about the continuous abuse count, right? A continuous abuse of a minor. So here is where, again, the iPhone and the iCloud data actually ended up screwing over David, right? So again, over here, the actual detective, Farrell in this case, showed, again, tons of information, again, selfies, passport information, driver's license from David's, and of course, banking records, and a fake North Carolina identification as well, too. So there were about 50 images, and the courts were the ones looking at obviously the non-explicit stuff, right? The two kissing each other, lying in bed together, on FaceTime, for instance, right? You can see all the screenshots out there. And again, the material that the prosecutors identified as CSAM material, which was reviewed by them, was basically described, obviously it was never shown, but obviously that also kind of existed. What was huge about this was something that was brought in their messages that they refer to as Operation Awesome. So the prosecutors say that Operation Awesome was actually a scheme for Celeste to run away from home and end up living with Burke. So David, right? And again, if that actually does hold up, it actually really reframes that whole like missing person report, the 3 missing people, the reports on her, from a runaway teenager's, pattern into something actually much more coordinated by an adult, right? This would actually be something that we could start saying is, again, her being groomed as opposed to just running away out of nowhere. It would establish that. So again, the messages that they were sharing in court between Celeste and David, they were talking about obviously a future together. They were talking about the fears of, pregnancy at such a young age. And of course, ultimately, one abortion that was at least happening in January 2024. So again, I have to imagine, right? Like, I don't know what it's like to obviously go through an abortion, but I imagine if you're like a minor, if you are going to go through an abortion, like there has to at least be some questioning, or parents do have to get, like you are a minor having a child aborted. Obviously, for that to happen, you would have to be, sexually involved with someone. And that, I'm wondering where the cops and where the family were when even this was happening, right? So again, the first messages they kind of had were November 2023, where they were talking about the fears of pregnancy, and obviously through this, they were establishing the start of this sort of sexual relationship. And then, of course, later, 8 to 9 January 2024, Celeste writes that neither of them can take care of it, followed again by the next day, a message from David being the last abortion before they have their own kids, okay? So again, this is a dude this is an adult talking to like a fucking 12, 13-year-old, okay? Disgusting shit. So of course, ultimately, June 2024, it's them holding packages of emergency contraceptives. Then of course, 9th July 2024 comes by where David writes that he's thinking about an abortion gift. Which again, it's like, if there's anybody that is allegedly more deserving of a death penalty, it's probably a scumbag like this. Like reading some of these messages, even the descriptions of them are harrowing stuff to read, And of course, by the end of this, Farrell walks into the court, and again, he has like 9,000 different text messages. But he shows, again, one final text message from Celeste, which was sent from the Uber that David had actually dispatched, right? Telling him that she was almost there and to open the door. And then her phone went permanently silent afterwards, right? So the arrival was actually at 10:10 p.m. on the 23rd of April 2025. And then, of course, there were unanswered messages 21 minutes later, right? which the prosecutors are arguing that's the time period that she was actually stabbed in. So again, it is fucking insane to go over here, right? The defense basically got in over here and said that, look, under cross-examination, Farrell conceded on a series of points that cut directly at those special circumstances. For one, Farrell saw that there was no indication Celeste ever threatened to contact law enforcement or pursue legal action against David, right? Her threats were actually going directly to David's mom, his friends, her own dad, and leaking information, right? There was no threat to go to the cop. And then, of course, she was pressing to come over 7 times. Again, this is the defense, kind of putting the blame on a little girl. I just want to kind of like bring that up here, right? So the defense basically said that she had asked 7 times to see him in the days before her death, right? Again, remember, she is a little girl, right? She is a minor at the end of the day. He is the adult. He didn't have to respond to her. He could have cut her off, could have got the parents involved. Allegedly didn't have to kill her, right? Just putting that out there. So she had apparently threatened to kill and mutilate him. And then again, what's wild is it seems like both sets of the parents, both David's parents and Celeste's parents, actually knew about this relationship, right? That even David had started attending church with members of her family. And apparently her parents even consenting for her to travel with the guy all the way to the United Kingdom. Like, the defense literally brought up a signed permission travel slip. It's fucking insane when I got to this point of the entire, case, because at the end of the day, look, I thought this was going to be a situation where, again, I saw her constantly be missing. I was always wondering where the parents were involved in this case, and it seems like the parents literally just let this poor girl absolutely face her death, right? So again, I wanted to look a little bit deeper into that situation as well too, right? So this permission slip, by the way, in my opinion, and again, I think the opinion of the cases that I brought up is not relevant to any form of defense. So Detective Farrell agrees to 4 things over here in this defense, right? That both the parents of David and Celeste knew about their relationship, so already bad right there. David was attending church with members of her family, which obviously they would know. The parents actually gave consent for her to go with him to London for a week. Now remember, okay, people will say that, well, they didn't consent to her having a relationship. I don't have to obviously put 2 and 2 together, but what do you think's going to happen when you make your daughter a groupie to this guy going all the way to the UK? Do you think they're just going to sit there and play like Fortnite all day? Like, are we being fucking serious? So again, the earliest that she had messaged him when she was like 11 and he was like 17, she had told him that he was like 16, and she was like, at times 18, right? And again, at the end of the day, you might think that that is some level of a defense, but not necessarily, and we'll get into why. So the prosecution wants to go at count 2, which is continuous abuse of a child under the age of 14, right? So again, that's kind of what the prosecution wants to go with. And again, the defense is basically trying to use this sort of her lying about her age as sort of some defense here, right? Which again, ultimately at the end of the day, one of the cases that I brought up was People v. Olson. So when it came to the case of People v. Olson back in 1984, the California Supreme Court held that a good faith, reasonable mistake as to the victim's age is not a defense to a charge under Penal Code Section 288, which is lewd contact with a child under the age of 14. So again, look, no matter what your view is, case precedent has been set that even if somebody lies about their age and you have a good faith reason to believe that lie, that does not protect you from the deeds that you have done. And again, there is also a contradicting record here too. So again, this People v. Olson won't really matter when I talk about, again, another big revelation that came into this case too. Again, the contradictions that came arising from this showed that the mom had apparently never met David whatsoever. The missing person reports that were placed, at least shows that, again, the parents who filed these reports required the cops to retrieve their daughter from the cities where the defendant lives are not obviously parents operating an approved arrangement, right? So obviously, even if the parents are doing these permission slips, having missing person reports, obviously, around where this guy lives is obviously a bit contradicting, right? It's weird. And then, of course, obviously, there were also the welfare checks that had occurred too, where deputies ended up going to his home. He was cooperative, said that he met her online. She had told him that he was 18. And here is where the deputies actually told him that she was 13. So what that basically means is, even if we look at the People v. Olson defense, the fact that a deputy had told her, bro, she's actually 13, kind of negates whatever like argument they want to bring up of that good faith, I didn't know what her age was. Then obviously Operation Awesome, as we discussed earlier, where they were devising the scheme allegedly for her to run away from her home and live with David, is something that, you know, could be considered an act of grooming. And that can be a very strong sort of incision into something much more serious in this case. So look, ultimately the end of all this, I think what it comes down to is David is without a doubt like actually incredibly fucked in the story. And I don't say that lightly, okay? Look, for a while when this happened, when this body was found, you know, when this whole Tesla story started, I wondered, man, why have the cops not busted the guy who owns the vehicle? I mean, it makes no sense. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this was the murder of a little girl. And, you know, when a body is that decomposed, at the end of the day, what it might seem like the LAPD or like any police agency is barely doing the minimum here, it's not necessarily that. It's that they know that there's something fucked up, but they can't ruin the case. And what it seems like is, you know, in the last 5 days, now that this case is actually going to go to trial, the prosecution have brought up thousands of messages, like pretty much caught the guy red-handed based on technical metadata. And ultimately, the end, I really feel like the state of California is going to make an example out of David, as they should. I'm not joking when I say if this stuff is proven 100% without a shadow of a doubt, or beyond a shadow of a doubt, really, that's the standard we set in the legal system, David deserves the death penalty, you know? At the end of the day, I don't think I've ever seen somebody this disgusting. Like, it almost feels like looking at like a serial killer that you would see in like history, right? But this is actually happening in real time. This is like you're witnessing one of the most heinous crimes happen. You're witnessing the, you know, alleged murder of like a little girl, right? And ultimately it's this guy who seems like he basically has no fucking remorse, right? Especially when a lot of the evidence kind of points towards him being the perpetrator for all this, right? It is really one of the most deplorable things that I've seen. And at the end of the day, I really don't know what more I can say other than this guy deserves the fucking death penalty. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the David case. It's about as updated as we're getting, and hey, we'll see how this story plays out when this case actually goes to court. But so much information has come out, and none of it is really good, obviously. You know, the subject matter is not a good thing. But ultimately, at the end of the day, look, it's a very serious case, and it's something that I've been enamored with ever since I first covered it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I really do want to see justice done. I think everyone does want to see it done, and I think hopefully the LAPD brings that motherfucking justice to this case. Ladies and gentlemen, this is me, Mutahar, and I'm out.